All right, folks, I think we'll go ahead and get started. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for being here today and for joining us to discuss the news that was shared earlier this week with the community about two HD drug trials, one from Novartis and one from Unicure. We recognize that hearing this news may have been difficult for many people, may have reminded some of you of previous disappointing news, like the Roche and Wave trials, and that there is a cumulative impact of hearing these reports. Joining me here today are Dr. Leora Fox, HDSA Assistant Director of Research and Patient Engagement, Jennifer Simpson, Licensed Clinical Social Worker, and HDSA Assistant Director of Youth and Community Services, and Dr. Victor Sung, Clinic Director at the HDSA Center of Excellence at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and Chair of the HDSA Board of Trustees. Our plan for today is to talk about what it is that we know, what that means for the studies and the people participating in them, what people are thinking and feeling, and finally to provide a place for you to ask questions for us to answer as much as we are able. Leora, do you mind going to the next slide, please? We will answer questions today after our panelists share some information, but you can ask them at any time through the use of the chat feature, which is down at the bottom of the screen. It's that little thought bubble that you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Just click on the chat button, type your question, and hit send. Only HDSA and today's panelists can see your questions, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. I will let you know that in some cases, the answer might be, we just don't know yet, but we do appreciate the question has been asked. Next slide, please. Today's session is also being recorded. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared for folks who couldn't make it here for the live opportunity today. So just know that you can find this in the next week or so on HDSA's YouTube channel or on the research webinars page on the website. Next slide. And without further ado, I'm going to actually turn this over to Leora, who will tell us a little bit about what it is that we know at this time. So thank you all so much again for being here. Leora, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Arik. So I think I'm not screen sharing anymore, and everybody is able to just see the panelists now. Is that right? Okay, great. Yeah, okay. So thank you, Arik. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'm Leora Fox. I'm the Assistant Director of Research and Patient Engagement at HDSA. And I want to start really by making sure that we've all got a little bit of background on what these two clinical trials are testing, and then kind of, recap what we learned on Monday. But I also want to acknowledge that HD research news can be an emotional roller coaster. Excuse me, more than one person has actually used those exact words this week. The scientists are not immune to it either, and many of them are here with you on this call. They're here with you on a community. They're inspired by the ways that this HD family comes together. So I really want to acknowledge that before I kind of jump into the science, and to thank you all for being here and for sharing your thoughts and your questions this week with the HDSA team. So I'm going to start with the news that we heard on Monday from Unicure. This is, again, going to be just very informal, no slides here, but Unicure is a gene therapy company. They are developing a treatment for HD called AMT-130, and it's delivered via a brain surgery. The therapy acts on the genetic message of the gene that causes HD, so it was designed to lower the amount of harmful Huntington protein that's found in the brain cells of people with HD. So there's been a trial going on for the past 2 years. Unicure planned for 26 people to have this surgery. Some would get the drug, some would have a sham surgery. Really the main goals of the trial are to test safety, to find a safe dose, and to see if AMT-130 can lower Huntington as expected. So it started with a smaller subgroup known as a cohort in the trial of 10 people who got the low dose of the drug. And then as those surgeries seemed to be going safely, about a year later, they started testing higher dose. So there was a positive update at the end of June, sharing that after a year, the low dose of the drug seemed to be safe. It seemed to be well tolerated. The Huntington lowering was starting to look promising. And what we learned on Monday morning, that's August 8th, for anyone who's watching this after the fact, what we learned is related to the high dose cohort of the study. So there were already 14 out of 16 people planned for that group who had gotten surgery. And Unicure shared this as part of a larger planned investor press release. And they shared that 3 of the 14 people in the group who'd gotten AMT 130 had experienced serious side effects in the couple of weeks following their surgery. So they had things like dizziness, headaches, vomiting, other neurological signs. And probably our MD on the call can talk a little bit more about that. But so we know that 2 of these people completely recovered, one of them partially recovered. The events are reported immediately by the doctors running the study. Unicure can then work with an independent committee that monitors the data, the FDA or its equivalent in other countries, to determine whether any steps need to be taken to protect people's safety. So I want to remind everybody that all clinical trials have these independent data monitoring committees or safety boards that look at the data as needed and at regular intervals before the company can. So everyone actually involved in the study, including the company, stays as unbiased as possible. And really, if anything concerning comes up, that's when the independent committee can make a safety recommendation. So in this case, the reactions reported by the doctors and the committee's review led Unicure to make the decision to pause new surgeries at the high dose. So that's what they shared Monday. That's where they're at right now, working with the community, the FDA for guidance. They want to better understand why the higher dose could have caused these side effects. But 24 out of 26 people in this trial have had the procedure, and they're now paused until they can put some more safety measures in place. And they will be able to share a bit more about what they found and what's next in the 4th quarter of this year, so likely around October. And just the bottom line really is that despite some of the headlines, despite some of the financial consequences you might have seen circulating, this is a pause in the trial. So there's absolutely the possibility that it could resume. I personally am feeling grateful for the many layers of safety monitoring here, but also hopeful that this could be a temporary roadblock. Thank you for all of those who are putting questions in the chat. As they come to you, please feel free to keep doing that. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Vibrant HD trial from Novartis and the news that Novartis shared on Monday with HDSA and other community organizations. So this was shared first on Friday with the participants, the investigators as well, and with HDSA and other and the community on Monday. So Novartis has been developing this Huntington lowering drug that can be taken by mouth. It's called branaplam. It also works by interfering with the genetic message for Huntington protein. Branaplam was actually developed for a different genetic disease called spinal muscular atrophy, which is fatal in babies and young children. But Novartis found out as they were working on branaplam that it also has the effect of lowering Huntington. So once they'd figured this out, they did some early safety trials in healthy adults to confirm. They pivoted to studying branaplam and HD, and they planned the Vibrant HD trial in adults with Huntington's disease. So the trial's meant to involve 75 people. It was designed to test 2 different doses of branaplam taken once a week for about 3 months. There was a low dose and a high dose planned. There's a small placebo group, about 20%. And the goal of this trial is to also to find a safe dose of branaplam and understand whether it's lowering Huntington in people with HD. So for the sake of safety, it started with the lower dose. No one had yet taken the higher dose. In this case, the Independent Data Monitoring Committee for Vibrant HD was looking at the early data from participants in the low dose branaplam cohort. They found that some of the participants were experiencing neurological side effects, in particular something called peripheral neuropathy. And that can involve things like changes in somebody's reflexes, numbness or tingling or pain in their hands and feet. They also did blood tests on participants throughout the trial, and they saw an increase in levels of a protein called NFL, which can be a sign of stress on the brain or the nervous system. And so for all these reasons, Novartis decided to suspend dosing. So they're temporarily stopped giving people in the trial branaplam or placebo. And that's the information that they shared on Monday. So what happens next for the Vibrant HD trial is that the independent committee and Novartis are going to continue analyzing the data and working with regulatory agencies. The participants will be asked to keep going to their study visits. That's super important for better understanding the effects of branaplam. And then Novartis can make a decision about what's next. So it's possible that this could be the end of development. It's possible that they could resume testing at a different dose or at a different frequency. It's possible that certain people were affected in different ways than others. Most of you will remember that these sort of after the fact analyses are what allowed Roche to kind of take a step back and then continue to develop their Huntington lowering drug, tominersen. But really, this is what we know so far about these two trials. We are waiting for more information while both of them take a pause to protect the participants, to learn as much as we can about really whether these treatments can be used safely in people with HD. So that's the summary kind of these two trials and the news that we've heard. And now I'm going to hand it over. I don't know if I'm handing it back to Arik or just straight on to Dr. Sung to talk a little bit more.
You can hand it back to me because I'd like to say thank you so much for providing those summaries. I think it's always good that we remember what the study's intent was and what they were looking for. And I think it's good to have that additional information as we think about this. And I will turn it over to Victor to talk a little bit more about, not just what has been learned so far in the studies to this point and that got us to this point, but what it might also mean moving forward. When, like Leora said, because studies have suspended dosing or have stopped the active interventional part of the trial, it's still important that the study goes on. So Victor, if you can add a little to that, talk about what this means, what it means for participants and the community moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Arik. And thank you, Leora. I mean, I don't have that much to add because Leora's summary was so comprehensive and excellent. I think the thing that I want to emphasize for both things is that unlike what happened with the Roche trial when the safety data was reviewed and Roche made the determination to halt the trial altogether, for both the Unicure and the Novartis trials, that is not the case. It's not like the studies are completely over. They've halted dosing, but the studies are going to continue to be ongoing. And I think that's an important distinction. We'll just do them in order. So in the same order that Leora discussed them. So the Unicure, remember, this Unicure study was a dose finding study. So the whole purpose of it is to figure out what dose is the safest and safest dose that we can do in humans with HD. So, I think the data of these safety events in 3 participants were all in the high dose group. And so, our feel is, well, so maybe high dose is not great, but maybe we keep going with low dose or with a lower dose still, or we'll have to see how Unicure wants to proceed with that. But the emphasis is that the study is still going. I saw some questions in the chat about are they going to continue to dose in low dose and or just not dose at all? But remember that with Unicure, it's a one-time dosing, so there's not continuous dosing. So even the high dose patients, they're going to continue to have data collected from them. We're still going to see those patients and follow up on them and see how they do. And then certainly all the low dose patients that have been treated, we're going to monitor those as well. But none of those side effects were seen in the low dose treatment arm. So we'll have to see. And then Unicure and Novartis as well have both been in continuous communication with the community, with the FDA and EMA, to make sure they're doing things methodically and safely to make sure that we protect all of you the best way that they can. So they're trying to consider what this is, what the safety measures, as Leora mentioned, are to put in place to better protect the subjects and better assess them. It might be extra visits, extra MRIs, changes, things like that. There was a question in the chat about, what do they know for sure? Is it the surgery itself, the procedure itself, or the medicine itself that's causing the problem? And the answer is they don't know for sure. I think they're assuming that it's related to the high dose of the drug, since none of these effects were seen in the low dose. But the only way to know for sure is to keep collecting data and check and see. Someone asked for a clarification about what does the placebo surgery entail in the Unicure trial. It is what they call a sham surgery, where the patient is taken to the operating room. They make an incision in the scalp, but they don't drill into the brain and don't actually penetrate the brain itself. But the patient stays in the operating room the same duration of time that a patient who actually received the drug would. So, you still wake up after anesthesia and you still have a scar on your scalp. So, nobody knows except for the surgeon which thing they actually received. But these side effects were all reported in patients who they know actually got drug, actually got the surgery, and received high dose. So just that clarification there. And remember that the low dose, they really didn't see anything. So I think no significant adverse events seen in the 12 subjects thus far that have received the low dose. So all those patients that either received low dose or got the sham surgery in the first round will have the opportunity to continue in the study. And if they got the sham surgery in the first part of the study, after the first year mark, they will have the opportunity to roll over and get dosed with a low dose. They're not offering the high dose as an option right now for obvious reasons, because of the safety concerns. But we'll have more data from this group, and then we'll kind of see how things go going forward. But I think that's the emphasis, is that the study is still going forward. The steering committee, the data safety monitoring board, could have recommended to stop the trial altogether, and they did not. They only recommended stopping dosing of the high dose. And similarly for Novartis, right? So for dosing has been suspended for all participants, but the study itself is not terminated. So, they could have similarly made the same recommendation. The steering committee, data safety monitoring board could have said, oh, these things that we're seeing with the neuropathy are so concerning, we want to shut down the whole trial altogether. But they did not recommend that. They just recommended, let's just stop dosing for right now, collect more information, see, is there a safe path forward to continue forward for Huntington's patients. Some people might ask, well, but their branaplam was already used by Novartis in patients with spinal muscular atrophy, right? Why didn't they see this then? Remember that spinal muscular atrophy is a disease affecting children, and it's just a different disease, and maybe Huntington's patients are more susceptible to the kinds of injury that the branaplam can cause. But that's why they already had safety measures, right? All of us that do clinical trials have talked about how we've never done an HD trial before where we have been following nerve conduction study tests in our HD patients in a clinical trial setting. So they're already trying to protect patients by looking for this ahead of time. And again, Novartis has also taken a very careful continuous communication approach, where they're communicating with the community, communicating with the governing boards to make sure they proceed very carefully and safely. So we don't know what the future holds yet, if they're going to end the trial altogether or take the learnings from the patients that have had these side effects and adapt the trial and continue forward. But we wait and see.
Victor, thanks so much for that. And I think, with what Leora shared about what we know to date and what you shared about kind of what we know in thinking about looking forward, one of the biggest points to underline, and you've both said this, but I think it's important that we repeat it, is the studies we're talking about today have suspended dosing. They've paused. They've not been terminated, like Victor said. these studies are still ongoing, and it is an important, and they're ongoing in different ways, which we can repeat a little bit more later, but it's important for folks who have been a part of it that you continue engaging in the study. And it's might seem frustrating to keep going forward if the study drug isn't being dosed anymore, but there's still so much more that's going to be learned. There's still so much that needs to be reviewed and assessed. And that can ultimately provide some information that can help move us forward, actually. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. I do want to turn over to Jennifer for this next part, which, this is, for many of you, this isn't the first webinar that you've been on where we've talked about a study not doing what we'd hoped it was going to do and the effect that it had. And it's very real for people who are either in the study or in the community at large to react to this news. And the fact that we're having, a very similar conversation again kind of speaks to the potential cumulative impact. So I want to turn it over to Jennifer to touch on that. So Jennifer, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Arik, and thank you guys for having me here. So one of the things I wanted to touch upon with folks today is the recognition that when we have news like this, like Arik mentioned, this is not the first time we've heard news like this, and it's not the first time, even the last 2 years, that we've had news like this, that it can bring us back to a place of grief and loss, and the recognition that as you go through your week, as you hear more news or you've heard this news, you might find yourself experiencing some of the same feelings, some of the same thoughts that you had when we heard about the Generation HD study, when we heard about the WAVE study, and recognize that that's completely normal and it's okay. We recognize that this has also been a few years where we've had a lot of losses, and not just when it comes to clinical trials, but when it comes to styles of life, folks who we've had in our community who are no longer with us anymore. And sometimes that impact of loss upon loss upon loss can also make these feelings and these thoughts a bit more intense as you, and it can come as a surprise. That's the other thing I think it's good to recognize, is that you might hear this news and think, they were pretty early on. This was, I wasn't participating in these trials. They were still in the, safety and dosing phase. Why am I feeling so angry? Why am I feeling, this pain, this feeling of shock again? Why am I back here? Why do I feel this again? And it's good to recognize that, one, there is a real impact of having these losses compounded upon each other. And to remember that as those losses compound, sometimes it means that our reactions compound as well. And if you find yourself feeling like that, one, give yourself the opportunity, give yourself the ability to just feel those feelings. I always talk about when we try and take those feelings and kind of clamp them down, try and put them away, put them in a nice little box, what ends up happening is you play a game of sort of emotional whack-a-mole, where those feelings pop up where you don't expect them, where you don't want them to pop up, because our emotions and our feelings are often going to come out whether we want them to or not. So one of the most important things to give yourself the opportunity to also move through these feelings is to let yourself feel them. Give yourself time, give yourself space. Make sure that you've got the support network that you need as you're feeling and as you're experiencing some of these emotions and these thoughts. The other thing to recognize about grief is often grief has triggers for us to bring us back to, when we thought, oh, but I was doing fine. I was okay. I'd moved past that. I was, maybe in a phase of acceptance, when we talk about phases of grief often, but grief doesn't work in a linear pattern. There will be moments that bring us back to previous stages, that bring us back to previous states of mind, and can sometimes be surprising. And the instance of hearing another trial that is not, like Arik mentioned, is not worked as we had hoped it would, can often bring us back to can be a trigger for us to bring us back to those previous stages of grief. And to recognize that, again, that's okay. And that's what might be happening for you right now. You might be kind of triggered back to how you felt in March of 2021, or how you felt during those times when we had more news that was similar for this community. Another thing I also wanted to touch on was also this could be putting in a bit of a sense of fear about participating in clinical trials. That's hearing especially about adverse events, hearing about people being in a hospital, people becoming really sick, can give us a sense of, of fear about what it means to participate in a clinical trial. And I wanted to validate that for folks that, yeah, especially when you're in the early stages of the clinical trial, often, we talk about that those are some of the bravest volunteers that we have in this community, because there are so many unknowns when you volunteer to be part of a trial. And it's always important, as you're thinking about participating, to make sure that you are doing so and being informed of the risk, of the potential rewards as you go through this process. And we know that part of being in a clinical trial, that especially that involves a brain surgery, that there are real risks for potential harm. And we are so grateful to all the volunteers and all the folks who are participating in the trial, who want to continue to participate. But it's also something that it's okay to be, to have that sense of fear, but recognize that for anybody who participates, it's really important to know what you're comfortable with if you want to participate in a clinical trial. What are the risks that you're willing to take, and to go forward in your own journey of potentially being part of research, knowing what those are for you. And that's just really important. So I know there's so many questions and so many things we want to get to. So I'll turn it back over to Arik and to the team to start answering some of those questions.
Jennifer, thank you so much for that. And to all of you who are here today, and to all of those of you who may be watching this later, what Jennifer's talking about is important to pay attention to. We react to things, right? We have hope for something, we have disappointment if that hope is not realized. There's that kind of additive effect. And I think it's always just important to remember that there are resources out there. Those of us at HDSA are happy to point you to any of those. I'm sure you're well aware of many of those things that you may already be in touch with, things like a support group or a social worker or a counselor, or your doctors at the HDSA Center of Excellence, right? These are all resources for you at this time, and hope that if you are having a hard time with this, whether it's processing the information or having an emotional response to it, please reach out to those folks that you may already be connected to, or get in touch with us to find out what things might be available. So thank you, all of you as panelists, for sharing this information, and for all of you for being here to hear it today. We do want to take an opportunity to open the floor virtually, as it is, to questions, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. I appreciate that everyone's been putting them in the chat all along, and we'll try to go back and review some of those and present them to the group. If you have more, don't hesitate to add them. So want to kind of jump into this. There's been a flurry of questions, so bear with me as we collectively sort through them. But some of the things that have come up and kind of in repeat, just for clarification, in Unicure, we're talking about a study that has had two arms of the study. First, this lower dose study, and then what we've been calling the higher dose. Someone asked about, what about a medium dose, or what does the higher dose mean for the lower dose? I think it's important to point out, and Leora, I think you spoke to this and maybe just want to reemphasize this. Part of what Unicure is doing is trying to optimize the dosage, right?
Yes, that's true. And because this is a single surgery with a single procedure, it's not as though, people are still doing their study visits and understanding, a lot more about the effects of the drug over time. So really it's a decision to pause those surgeries, the last couple of surgeries that were planned for the trial. And it's totally possible that there will be ways to kind of mitigate that. I'm not sure I quite answered the question properly, but it sort of leads into another set of questions that we're getting from a lot of folks, which are kind of along the lines of, if people feel better after a particular dose, after they've experienced some, potentially severe side effects, but the drug is working in other aspects, or it could, slow symptoms of Huntington's disease, or it's, if that turns out to be the case, why not, push forward if these kinds of side effects would resolve? Along the same lines, a couple of people have said things like, I would choose peripheral neuropathy over the symptoms of Huntington's disease that I'm experiencing, right? So again, this is why, for the time being, this is a pause to learn more, and to really see if these are long-lasting safety effects, and that's really what these trials are designed to do, alongside finding the right dose. So, a high dose versus a low dose, it's all, we could say what the amounts are, but it's all kind of relative to someone who isn't a doctor or a chemist or understands all of that. But these are considered decisions based on all kinds of research in cells and animals that have now been translated into people. So those are really the goals, are to find out are these safety effects balanced out with the potential benefit of the drug, and how much drug is necessary or possible to give to people to get the right effect.
I appreciate that last point, and it's something I'm gonna actually ask Victor, if you don't mind weighing in on this. Right, a lot of times people will say, "Hey, like Leora said, I will totally take peripheral neuropathy compared to knowing what I know about living with the symptoms of Huntington's disease." But there's a reason that an experimental drug and the company that is doing the study, the oversight committees, there's a reason that they look at these things. And I kind of emphasize that by saying it's experimental. So you're paying attention to anything, but how do we balance that? How do we balance the potential cost of a treatment, of a potential treatment, excuse me, and the symptoms and severity of the disease itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the $1 million question, right? I think that's, I get this all the time from my patients. Like, I want you to give me the treatment that will fix all my symptoms and not cause any side effects. We all wish that we had that. If we could stop Huntington's disease and not cause any side effects, that would be amazing. But the reality is these high potency drugs have the potential for high potency side effects. And it's a very difficult balance that these companies have to decide what level of side effects is too much, right? And they're trying to decide based on input from the community. What do they think, HD patients and families would want? But they also have to consider, would the FDA approve it? That's why they've been having, because we wouldn't want to push forward and say, well, the community, all the patients say that they would take peripheral neuropathy, but then it gets to FDA and the FDA is like, no, that's not an acceptable level of side effects. We're not going to approve this drug. And then they shut it down, right? So that's why they need to have these constant communications with these governing bodies as well. Or even if the governing bodies approve it, but it gets out into the community and there's side effects and the community says, well, that's too much side effects for us, right? So these are all the considerations the company's trying to weigh in. And it's this risk benefit ratio that we talk about, right? What's an acceptable level of risk to try to achieve the benefits that we want to achieve? And it's hard. These are very difficult things, but that's why they're taking a pause to consider these questions very carefully, which I appreciate, instead of just, they could have taken the approach, no, we ignore that, we're going to just barrel forward, or, you know what, that's too much, we're out, right? And they didn't take that. They said, like, let's just take a step back. Both companies are just taking a step back, and let's take a look at this and see what's the best way forward.
I think something else that has been touched on in some of the questions, and I think something for us to consider is, both of these compounds that we're talking about, as well as thinking, to what we've learned and are learning about tominersen and what we've learned from the WAVE trials and what we're going to be learning from PTC. There's a lot of things that unfortunately are going to still have a lot of unknowns or question marks to, because these things are newish in the possibility of treating the disease of Huntington's disease, right? So Unicure has people who have been in that lower dose trial for upwards of 2 years now. And so there's a lot that's being followed, but this is also, like Leora said, that was a one-time treatment. So we need to watch over time to see what happens. The fact that both of these studies are good examples of things happening kind of early on in the process, right? The Unicure side effects were reported shortly after the procedure was done, right? So this is the 3 cases that we've been talking about, all were reported within weeks of the person undergoing the surgical procedure and the drug administration. The news from Novartis, this was a very early part of the study. People were just starting to be dosed and these things were noted, and therefore the company and the oversight committees are saying we need to look at this more closely, right? Leora, I don't know, I think I may have addressed it myself, but just if you can say something about the fact that these are things that we're going to have to watch over the longer term too, right? So side effects that come up early on are things that have to be thought of in balancing that risk benefit analysis, also saying that is just early on. We don't know what that means in the longer term, right?
Yep, and a couple people have kind of mentioned in the chat, and we've got probably 100 questions at this point, comments. So thank you, everyone. Doing our best to address a lot of them. Yeah, I think. Oh, my brain has gone. I'm sorry, everyone. Arik, can you just repeat that, because I am looking through everybody's great comments.
I hear you, and all of you. Thanks again for the questions, Leora. What I was just saying is, we talk about
short term versus long term.
Yeah, the
Thank
balance
you for
of
the reminder.
cost and benefit, and then short term versus long term.
Yes, so especially for the Unicure surgery, there's a surgical recovery. There is then a sort of close 1-year follow-up, followed by 5 additional years, followed by 4 more years of follow-up. So when we're talking about slowing down or stopping the progression of a disease that takes a long time to develop and that changes a lot over time, there are a lot of different things to measure. There's considering the fact that there's a permanent alteration in the genetics of someone's brain after this. And so it's really important to consider what that's going to look like, both short term after a surgery and long term after a long time. And somebody mentioned in the chat, look at cancer drugs. You could have a year of really horrible side effects, followed by a remission. So it's not a perfect analogy, but it's definitely, we have to consider safety and efficacy over a longer term. And this is just the first step here.
No, thanks for that, Leora. Jen, I'm going to turn over to you for a second. There was a question that I think is important, right? Someone was mentioning it is frustrating to participate in a study, and then when the dosing is stopped, you're asked to keep going, right? And just curious what your thoughts are on that and what you might suggest to someone who finds himself in that situation, or someone who's even in the community saying, I'm frustrated because of that. Why would I want to keep going in something like this?
Yeah, to keep going and keep being monitored and keep having to deal with doctor's visits and tests and all of that. Yeah, and I think what we're hearing is frustration and anger, right? The frustration and anger of having put yourself in a position of being vulnerable, in a lot of these cases, physically vulnerable, right? Especially if you're undergoing a brain surgery or even a sham brain surgery. As well as emotionally vulnerable, right? Because when you're part of a clinical trial, you're also inevitably feeling a lot of that hope of success. You're feeling a hope of that hope that one, you will be getting active drug, and 2, that you will be potentially one of the first folks to experience a curative or real disease modifying treatment for Huntington's disease. And to have that reality shift is incredibly difficult. So I think, one, recognizing that frustration and anger for yourself is really important. Let yourself feel that. That's okay. One of the things I think that's really important to also have in the back of your mind is that even in the times when dosing might be paused or stopped, that doesn't, you're still an incredibly important part of this process. The information that you're able to provide will allow those scientists, allow these companies to continue to tweak either if we're looking at dosage changes, if we're looking at changes in molecules, if we're looking at, changes in how we attack Huntington's disease from a therapeutic standpoint. The information that you provide is still critical in that in this process. So you are still, even though it might feel like, geez, am I making a difference? What is the point here? You are still making such a huge difference. And sometimes that can be a really helpful sort of piece of information and sort of a mantra to hold on to for yourself as you feel that frustration, as you feel that anger. When it gets to that point of feeling overwhelming, is sort of having that shift in mental thinking of, but I'm still really making a difference. I'm still really important here, and what I'm doing is still really important. That would be something I would think about. The other thing is find people to express these feelings to, find people to express that anger to, whether it's in a support group, whether it's to, the researchers and the doctors who you're working with, and say, man, this is really frustrating and I'm hurting and this is really tough, because inevitably those PIs, those researchers are probably feeling the same way, or feeling that same frustration. And they can also give you that perspective of, here's why we still want you to come in. Here's why this is still so important for us and still important for you to be a part of this, and share in some of that grief with you.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think I'm going to ask a question that is sometimes a hard question to answer, because we're talking about a person's personal experience of something in the context of a larger kind of controlled experimental setting, right? Someone was sharing their own experience of taking part in the Unicure study, and did not have a positive experience and did not feel like they were necessarily being listened to when they expressed that. Victor, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about, it's an important thing that we all hear from the person who's going through it, because that is what they're experiencing and what is happening. But then how is that also looked at through the lens of the oversight committee, the regulatory agencies, the doctors involved in the study itself, right? How might those things not always feel like they line up? It's a massive question, and I'm totally putting you on the spot with it, but hoping you can touch on
think
that.
it's hard, for me as the clinician taking care of my HD patients, but also the other hat that I wear is trying to execute these trials. I fully take that on, right? I mean, it's a very, what I am getting from the question you're asking is, how do we take into account the patient's perspective about, like, which trial am I supposed to do? Which one is likely to fail or not fail? Which one's the best one for me, given the risks, given what's coming down the pipe? Should I not do this one and wait for the next one? And it's very difficult. These are very difficult decisions. I try, as investigators, yes, we are under pressure for, like, this trial is open and it's open for this kind of patient, and find the right patient that fits in that and get them plugged in. But all of us that do this, we take care of HD patients and families ourselves, right? It's not like there aren't really any HD clinical trial researchers who are separate and outside of an HD clinic, right? So just know that we're always considering this. Like, if a trial fails or has side effects and we put one of our patients in there, I mean, as investigators, we struggle with that. Like, did I expose my patient to risk and possible harm? But we fully take this on, like, trying to balance, like, what is the best thing for my patient, not just what's the best thing scientifically and for this study. For me, I just always think about it that way. Yes, we have to do the work and do the science, and it's critically important for us to do it as investigators and for patients and families to participate. We can't get new therapies without that. But we take that very seriously and very carefully on, which trial do we recommend for which patient, and, knowing that there are very, very narrow windows and things like that. It's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and caring about. But it's hard. It's just trying to take it all into consideration.
Yeah, Victor, I appreciate that. And I think that's, to those of you that are participating in studies, those of you that are thinking about participating in studies, in most cases, like in Victor's clinic, he's wearing those multiple hats. I'm there to help, offer my services, offer whatever care I can, but also I'm engaging in this research aspect of it, and trying to help you figure out what might be the best study for you and which ones might not be appropriate for you sometimes even, and having to balance all those things, but knowing that it's ultimately the doctor that you're working with is ideally focusing on you and your well-being. Leora, I know there was a number of interesting questions that have come up about something, and I'm hoping you can try to summarize that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm seeing some questions about, that are related to whether we have more information. So, do we know yet if these drugs, despite their major side effects, are having an effect on Huntington levels as planned? Do we know whether they're helping with other symptoms or slowing other symptoms? And then questions like, why did this happen at this particular dose? And a lot of those questions, they're very good questions. The answer right now is we do not know yet. And even for some of those kind of bigger questions about, whether it's harmful ultimately to lower good Huntington, because a person with Huntington's disease will have some expanded Huntington and some normal length Huntington in their bodies, and all of the two drugs that we're talking about today are both lowering, to a certain extent, all Huntington levels. And really the answer is that we don't know yet. We don't have more information than we've shared today about what's going on with the data from these trials. That's what we're waiting for. And as far as, in the longer term, what it means to lower Huntington, there's still definitely a lot of hope and a lot of activity around Huntington lowering, both non-selective and selective. But the truth is that we don't know in humans. We have a lot of great evidence from experiments and from models in animals that this could be a good strategy for slowing the symptoms of HD, but that's where all of these trials are going. So unfortunately, the answer to many of the questions today is we don't know yet, and that's incredibly frustrating for everyone, but that's what we're all working towards.
Yeah, I think that appreciate that, Leora, and the answer being we don't know yet can be a really frustrating thing to hear, right? Because I want to know now. You just shared this really big piece of information. I want to know now. What I hope is useful for people to hear is, when we had these conversations after the Roche trial was discontinued, there's been a lot that's been learned since. And while it was a big blow to the community when that study's news was announced, there's still things that have been coming from it, things that have been, we've had more data being shared. We also know that there's going to be an announcement in the next month, actually, about their next phase 2 trial, based on what was learned from that first one. So even though right away, it's really disappointing, it might be frustrating, it might be something that really upsets people, it's that continued participation, it's that continued work that is being done that sometimes reveals additional information that could be useful in the future. There was a couple questions that have been coming up about, how do I know which trial is right for me? And I would say, simple answer to that is talk to your doctors, talk to the researchers that read the things that are available that talk about inclusion-exclusion criteria. But Jennifer, I'm going to turn it to you, just because part of this is also saying not just which one do I fit the criteria for, but that very personal decision of what's right for me, right? Talking about a little bit like risk assessment and personal tolerance to things, right?
Yeah, and this is, we talk about how important it is for folks to manage and live with Huntington's in the way that's best for them. As you sort of are thinking about your life with HD, your life with your partner's life with HD, it's so important to really do some of that analysis for yourself. Say, what am I willing to to be okay with? What am I willing to sacrifice? What risk am I okay taking? Knowing that there might be failures, knowing that, the outcomes might not be what we want. And that you might be one of those folks who experiences side effects, or you might be one of those folks who doesn't get active drug. So that's really important to be sort of working that out for yourself. And for some people, the answer is yes, I'm in, I'll do whatever. If this gives me even a chance, I'm in, sign me up. But the other thing to also think about is, this is also time that you're giving up, time that you're taking to participate in a clinical trial, time that you're taking to go to visits with your neurologist and or your clinical trial site. What is going to be best for you? And the answer is completely personal. There's no right answer. It's just the answer that's right for you.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think it's balancing your own criteria, right? What am I able and willing to do? What does my life look like that allows me to do? And balancing that with the information that you get from ideally your treatment team, the research information sites you go to, trying to balance that as best you can, and hopefully having someone like Dr. Sung to be able to say, hey, I need help balancing these things out, being able to tap into that when possible. We are getting close to time, but I wanted to say there's so many great questions. And again, we've got all of these and we have them all, and to see if there's potentially a way we can share more information in the future. We also are very hopeful that as Novartis, as Unicure learns more, that they'll have an opportunity to share in the future too. So stay tuned for news. Again, whenever there's a situation like this where a company pauses dosing, or if they ever have to stop a trial, the reason that people continue on and why we ask everyone to keep going to those study visits is because data is still being collected. Things are still being learned. And there are times when we do hear back and they say, this is what we now know based on the subjects who were willing to volunteer and be a part of this study and who went through this. There's information still to be gathered, and that will be shared in the future. So all of you all who are here, are kind of, I think this, but just stay as engaged as you are able and willing to do. To the panelists, any final thoughts, any things that you would like to say to the folks that are here today or that will be watching this later that you want them to walk away with? I'm going to ask Leora to go first, and she unmuted.
I've unmuted. I want to say that because a lot of people have also asked, from a personal perspective, you talked, to the idea of, I have all these choices out there. What should I choose? And that, of course, requires a lot of self-reflection and speaking with, medical professionals and all of that, if you are lucky enough to have that choice and are, brave enough to participate. But in general, there's lots of folks who are wondering, what's the next thing that we can hold on to hope for? And I wanted to speak to that, certainly. And I can be specific here. There are companies that we know are developing other oral Huntingtin lowering drugs. PTC Therapeutics is currently doing a trial of their oral Huntingtin lowering drug. It's called PTC 518. It's different from branaplam. It may have a little bit better penetrance into the brain, for example. So we're looking at that. Roche is about to start a new phase 2 trial of tominersen. There was a publication this week as well that Vasinex published some of their data from the Signal trial, and there was maybe some promise there in terms of moving that drug forward. Prolenia is working on pridopidine, and Nexon is working on a drug that's targeted at a part of the brain's immune system. There's really a lot out there that's actually in or approaching clinical trials, and there are other companies, dozens of them, that are working on these. Also on oral splicing modulators, on all different sorts of approaches to HD biology. I know that type of sort of generalized, here's a hopeful platter, is also not always satisfying, but it is there. It is not the end of the road, and it is something that we're all thinking about and placing hope in as well. So I didn't want to let that go before we said goodbye today.
Yeah,
No.
I'm actually going to jump off of what Leora was talking about, because I was thinking something very similar, is that if you are in a place where you are experiencing a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of hopelessness at the moment, to give yourself an opportunity for some of the light to come in, whether it's related to clinical trial news or whether it's related to things that you can do in your everyday life that just bring you joy and make you feel happy, make you feel, give you a chance to see the other sides of life that exist. Make sure that you give yourself the opportunity to do that. You know, for folks who are in that place where it looks dark, it looks kind of bleak, I'll allow the light in.
Yeah, and I would just add to that like it's not just, I mean, the platter and the quantity of things that are going on now and coming down the pipe is great, but I wanted to emphasize that, like, it's not just the quantity, it's the quality, right? Like, I take care of other patients that besides HD patients, and there's no other community of scientists and patients and families like the HD community. Like the level of engagement, it's not just, you know, companies wanting to throw anything that will stick. Like the way that they're engaging the HD community, and really caring about wanting to bring a therapy is different than the engagement in other communities. That's a testament to you all as the HD community, and just to that message of hope that the companies, the researchers, the clinicians, the scientists, the level of care, like the amount that people care about you and your families is very high, and very impressive. And for me, it's an honor to be a part of that community, and just know that we're all here for you and fighting for you every day.
Victor, I'm going to follow up to what you just said too, and I think it's something to be very, I hope that you are all aware of, is the level of engagement in the HD community from the people who are the folks living with HD, whether you have it yourself or you have a loved one who does, or you know somebody who does. That community engagement is above and beyond. But there are other layers to the community, other constituents to the community who are more involved in this particular disease group than in many others that, you know, some of the providers on the call might know from working with. The doctors, the scientists, the drug companies, the regulatory bodies, the level of connection, conversation, communication amongst all of these groups keeps things moving forward. Even when we hear news like what we did this past week from Novartis and Unicure. On Monday, we also heard from Sage, who is launching a new trial and starting a new trial that is expanding the work that they've been doing. To the point that Leora made, we've heard news from other companies that are moving things forward. We're going to hear things from Roche, who we had this conversation with a year or so ago, moving something forward next month that you're going to hear more about. So while the news can hit hard, there's still other news that's in the mix. To the point that Jennifer said, you might not see it right now and you might not want to, but amongst all of the kind of darkness, there is still light, and to find that and to see what that does moving forward. I want to thank all the panelists for the time today. I want to thank all of the audience, everyone who's watching it now, everyone who watches it later, for making the time to do it. I want to thank everyone who's participated in research, in any clinical trial, in any observational trial, for your time, because that's what keeps moving things forward. I think this is something that, you know, we do our best to continue to make sure you know as much as possible, even if sometimes our answers are we don't know right now, but stay tuned, to make that available to you in the community, and to encourage you to stay engaged, to stay on top of it as much as you're able and comfortable in doing so. When you're not doing well with it, please know that those of us here at HDSA and the clinics and the social work network and our support group network are here for you at that time. And if you don't know how to find it, visit the HDSA website, www.hdsa.org, and it can connect you to places in your own community, can connect you to groups of like-minded folks to be able to talk about this. Thank you all again, whoever you are and whatever way you're connected with HD, for being a part of this, especially to those of you who are the participants in the studies and are continuing in the studies and are thinking about future studies. Thank you for your time today. We look forward to talking to you again in the future and wish you all our best. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.